Greetings and welcome to all of you who've joined us here today for this webinar, which is actually the first in a series of webinars that we'll be executing here at SIEER to help prepare our members for their participation in our responses. And today's webinar is going to focus on the Field Assessment Structural Teams, or FAST, in SIEER, and particularly looking at their role within the response to hurricanes in preparation for this year's hurricane season. Before we get into the webinar content, I did want to express appreciation on behalf of SIEER to a number of entities, beginning first and foremost with the National Science Foundation, which provides the support for SIER's efforts, but also the wider collaborations that SIEER is fortunate to have with our Extreme Events consortium of organizations under the banner of Converge. And working with this growing list of organizations that are all working to advance disaster research and reconnaissance research under these new umbrellas created by the National Science Foundation has been an incredibly exciting opportunity for all of us. SIEER would also like to recognize the generosity of FULCRUM, which provides at no cost our mobile application for damage assessment as part of the FULCRUM community program. And finally, we just want to thank all of you for your voluntary participation in SIEER and the sacrifices that you make and that your institutions make to let you be a part of the responses that we execute, and the fact that you make the time and effort to be a part of this very important work. We do appreciate that. So our webinar today, our agenda is as follows. We're going to begin with this welcome and opening from myself. And I'm Tracy Kajewski-Correa. I'm the director of SIEER. And then we're going to move into a segment that helps explain a little bit of the workflow for our field assessment structural teams. David will help us with that. And our other associate director, another David, will introduce us to the FULCRUM platform for door-to-door damage assessments, with Ian helping us lead a 10-minute question and answer session at the conclusion. It is our hope that by the end of this webinar, you will at least have an understanding of the role of our field assessment structural teams in our event responses, as well as be conversant in the response workflows that we have created, the products that we'll be building together, and have a working or at least a basic knowledge of the approach that SIEER takes in particular to door-to-door assessments using the FULCRUM mobile application. Now, for questions, what I would ask everyone to do is to please, as we're going through the webinar, if you have any questions or comments, please do hit the chat logo. That little bubble there at the bottom of your screen will activate this chat window. And just go ahead and type your questions or comments in that box, and we will queue those up for our question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Please do make sure that the "to everyone" is tagged when you make that comment so people can see your questions. We would also ask that everyone please take a moment to mute themselves within Zoom. If you're joining us through the web interface, that's simply achieved by clicking this little microphone icon in the lower corner. If you're joining us by phone, you can mute and unmute within Zoom through a telephone connection by typing *6, or you could also just choose to mute your phone directly using the mute feature that's inherent to that hardware. So we appreciate that little bit of housekeeping, and with that, we'll get started with introducing SIEER's vision and mission. So our goal here at SIEER is to build societal resilience by generating new knowledge on the performance of the built environment through what we hope to be very impactful post-disaster reconnaissance that's disseminated widely, including to those most affected. SIEER is charged primarily with deepening our capacity as a natural hazards engineering community for doing this kind of post-event reconnaissance, and we work to achieve this through 3 pillars. The first is around capacity building and promoting community-driven standards and best practices and even training like you're experiencing today to help our community grow in its capacity for this kind of work. The second is coordination. By giving us these funds and the right to deploy teams at our discretion, we can have very early access to these scenes for very efficient and impactful reconnaissance efforts that capture perishable data much more swiftly than the traditional rapid mechanism. And we encourage collaboration. Our teams are built up from the community, sort of on the fly as events unfold. And so we're able to link communities of research, practice, and policy together to accelerate the learning from disasters. So under these 3 pillars, it really is our hope that by creating such a broad base and equipping it well, that we're going to have the leadership from the community necessary to make SIEER self-sustaining, and to be able to support our goals of helping to mitigate the effect of disasters on our communities. The governance structure for STEER, currently we're in our 2-year launch period under our initial EAGER award, and that means our job right now is to design STEER and get it up and running. So the 5 individuals you see here who serve as our leadership team were the individuals who were the co-PIs on that initial EAGER grant, and our job is to get this organization off the ground. You'll notice in our associate directorship we have representation across both wind and seismic hazards, but we've also selected cross-cutting themes like assessment technologies and data standards that we hope will unify the hazards accordingly. Now, what we're excited to announce is that STEER will now start to launch a steering committee, which will expand this governance structure and help to guide the vision and development of STEER and our event responses, as well as working groups for community members to join to begin advancing the technology and the standards that are behind everything we do here at STEER. So we're very excited for those to be unfolding shortly. So the community that is engaged by STEER is a wide range of stakeholders who are all interested in the performance of the built environment and other and infrastructure such as buildings and civil infrastructure. And so as a result, we do engage academia, the private and public sectors, government, nonprofit, and the public at large, even in our efforts. But where we do hone ourselves is in considering the kind of hazards we respond to. STEER is really looking at natural hazards that cause structural damage and generally through dynamic load effects. So as a result, we tend to focus on wind events like hurricanes and tornadoes. We also focus on earthquakes and tsunamis. But this kind of focus would have us less inclined to react or respond to things like wildfires or inland flooding. Another point of clarification that's important to make is to clarify the distinction between what STEER does and what other mechanisms like the NSF rapid grants do. STEER is really not equipped or designed or intended to explore individual research questions from the community or hypotheses that come from the community per se. Our job is to collect and curate high-quality perishable evidence of the damage to the built environment, and while we might enter into that process with some overarching hypotheses or objectives, it's really not the kind of in-depth hypothesis-driven research that one might expect from a rapid grant. Our mission will create some objectives and sampling targets. We'll move in swiftly to acquire data in a very strategic way. And then our goal is to move that data and those reports out to the community as swiftly as possible so that other members can use that data to conduct research, and so that those reports and that first set of boots on the ground can really feed back to NSF and the community about what other follow-on reconnaissance activities should be undertaken. And that might be by individual researchers who would in turn apply to NSF for a rapid grant, or to another agency, or other reconnaissance groups like some of the other members of the EER kind of consortium, those other extreme events groups. So that's an important distinction that we want to make in STEER to help everyone understand how this communal effort is meant to inform more in-depth investigation, but certainly is not comprehensive in and of itself. Now, STEER membership is structured in 4 levels. And in soliciting membership to STEER, we try to attract people who have formal training or experience as structural engineers or working in another allied field of natural hazards engineering, such as coastal engineering, wind engineering, or earthquake engineering. Now, these individuals get the opportunity to deploy as either part of a virtual assessment team, which we call a virtual assessment structural team, which we call the VAST, or the field assessment structural team, which we call our FAST. You'll notice in green that STEER is also recruiting data and computer scientists because we would like to better automate our workflows, integrating the various assessment technologies and enriching data with other third-party data sources. We'd love to automate that and make that even more efficient for our team, so we're looking to build capacity in those areas. But focusing now on the individuals who'd fall into those orange categories, we sort our membership annually based on 4 levels. Our level 1 members have no prior field experience, and they really haven't had much substantive participation in a virtual assessment team. So as a result, we would encourage them to focus their efforts in that year in participating in our VAST responses. A level 2 individual similarly has not achieved any field experience, but they have put in time on our VAST teams. And as a result, while they're encouraged to continue to be active in the VAST, they would be eligible to be what we call a FAST trainee. A FAST trainee is an individual looking for their first field experience, in which case we would hold a slot on a field assessment team for one of these individuals so they could be mentored by these more senior or veteran personnel in the context of a field response. Now at level 3, we have individuals who do have prior field experience in collecting data, and those individuals can again be a part of the VAST, but they also are qualified to be a member of a field assessment structural team. They also are invited to be a member of any of the working groups that SIEER is now forming. And at level 4, we have the individuals who have significant prior event experience out in the field. So they can do all the things that a level 3 personnel can do, but they also have the opportunity to lead a FAST themselves. They also can be a part of our steering committee, and their site may be a regional node to help us better coordinate our responses geographically across the country and eventually across the world. Now, to help these individuals operating at the various levels, and our focus in this webinar is on the field assessment structural teams, which are primarily level 3 and 4 STEER members with an occasional level 2 as a trainee. What we've done is created a STEER Google Drive. And this is a type of what we call a shared drive in the Google context. And so you'll see it in your Google Drive on the left-hand side. There'll be a list of folder structures, and you'll see ones called shared drives. This is distinctive from shared with me. You look for shared drives, and under that you'll find the STEER members drive that you've all been added to if you're a STEER member. Now, STEER members all have been asked to review the member guidelines. That is our first and primary guiding document. And if you're going to be deploying in a field assessment structural team, we've also circulated and archived in this drive the Field Assessment Structural Team Handbook. We encourage everyone to take a look at that handbook and familiarize themselves with it. We're going to do a high-level walkthrough of that handbook today. Now, the rest of the table that you see here is an appendix. It's actually Appendix A in that handbook, and it catalogs the various resources that we've built up to help in the FAST missions. The ones that are shaded in green are the ones used routinely by FAST members, either through an expectation from STEER or by necessity. We, for example, provided all of you with a badge upon enrollment that can be used as a credential. We have an access letter that can help you secure access to restricted areas during your deployment. We ask that every one of our FASTs submit a daily summary each night of their activities, so we have a template for that. We also have the FAA request form for those engaging in UAVs during their mission. And we also have something called the pre-deployment briefing, and that's a document produced by STEER to outline the targets and strategy for the event response that's shared with the FAST members prior to their departure. So again, these assets in green are critical. The ones in white are additional optional resources that are made available. Again, all of this is discussed in Appendix A of the Field Assessment Structural Team Handbook, and all of these resources again reside on that shared Google Drive. So now I'm going to hand off the presentation and transition it over to Dave Pravat, who's going to step us through the workflow for our field assessment structural teams. David?
All righty. Thanks, Tracy. So in the next slide, you see this is how our fast deployments begins. If I stole this picture from CNN yesterday, looking at Tropical Storm Dorian. We at the STEER leadership and hopefully the entire membership will be taking cognizance of what is happening around ourselves around the globe and reporting back. When we find a major hazard event, in this case a hurricane or Dorian is currently now 4 days out or 7 days out from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. There are three approaches that we can do. The initial one would be a major hazard event with little structural impact. We may decide to do an event briefing only without forming a VAST or a FAST team. When structural impacts are anticipated, we activate the VAST so that we can cull from the media multiple reliable sources to get information collected into our preliminary virtual reconnaissance reports, the PVRRs. And in the third highest level, when there is the the ability to find some learning opportunities, both the FAST as well as a VAST, which continues, will pour their efforts into producing an early access reconnaissance report, EARR. So 24 hours outside of an event, we expect to have that briefing on the ground. The reason for this rather accelerated timeline is that we want to get our information out within the news cycle of that hazard. And this varies depending on the scope of the hazard itself. But for the briefing, within 24 hours is quite doable. The preliminary virtual reconnaissance within 2 to 3 days, 72 hours. And by the time you have returned from a fast deployment, within 48 hours, we'd like to have something on the ground. The data sets and the curation of that takes considerably more time, 30 days, and probably sometimes, depending, it could be even further than that. Next slide, please. Okay, so breaking down those 4 stages of the FAST itself, I just want to, with that accelerated timeline, mention that you know, our goal is not to collect everything, but to give the community and the general public a snapshot of what we have seen. And it would be up to others to do the rapids and so on. But at the pre-deployment stage, this is where all the logistical activities occur. Well, not all, but hopefully the lion's share of that, using the dedicated Slack channels. Every disaster or every event will have its own Slack channel, whereby members will get into the hotels, flights, etc., and even maybe determining what teams are going to be assigned and how those teams are going to move, etc. As you go through the pre-deployments, the members are encouraged to use the FAST handbook for further guidance, and as much as possible, coordinate your efforts on Slack rather than email or telephones. Try to confirm it there so that folks who join later, after some decision has been made, has the ability to go back and look at different things. During the deployment itself, one of the things we highlight here is the daily summaries, which are pretty important activities because it feeds information from that FAST up through to the leadership and thereby to the NSF, but it also assists us with getting information back to the virtual assessment survey teams who are working in parallel to the FAST members out in the field. And this is an important consideration because what you do in the field is then mirrored by someone who is helping maybe verify, check, or give you certain information that you have not had the time to figure out. During the deployment itself, we would encourage everyone to ensure that they synchronize their FULCRUM apps regularly, at least twice a day, and check the Slack channels for additional information as we go along. In most cases, you will have a backup storage in the field just to have a belts and suspenders approach to securing our data. In the post-development deployment stage, the important thing is, as Tracy said, this is not a rapid per se, but members of the FAST may join with VAST members or others to develop rapid proposals for funding, and you're free to use all the data that we store on Design Safe as we go along. Next slide. So the day of a deployment is pretty long, and that goes without saying. We start early and we pretty much end late. the important task at the start of the day is this business about the objectives and targeting for data collection. Many times we will determine with the fast leads what we're collecting, why, and how, so that you know, we maximize the time of everybody's efforts in the field. Before you wheels up on mornings, you would want to have your FULCRUM app checked and synchronized again, and check the latest that you are available on Slack. Things like getting FAA authorization should UAV flights be done, ensuring that batteries are charged, and so on and so forth. And during the day, it's teams could be several or major one, dispersed over wide areas. You will have to find ways to communicate there. Sometimes the cell phones may not work, and the texting is best. And in the afternoon, I have found that this is a valuable time for slight downtime with members who are staying in the same place to debrief and compare notes and contribute to the preparing of that daily summary, preparing of photographs and so on. And because all of this is done using Google Documents, once there is a Wi-Fi available, everyone's, you know, all hands on deck, and we can get this work done rather quickly. Next slide, please. In terms of the assessment tools that we use, we have found that the best approach has been bring your own tools, bring your equipment and notebooks and techniques that you have been most familiar with if you were a forensic engineer. That way, you know, the effort is maximized, and we get the most efficient, up-to-date things that way. These 4 tools that David is going to speak about later, you know, we have the Street View cameras, scanning technologies, and UAVs, all available. Some of the tools that you may need are available for rental from the NERI Rapid site itself, and these have to be done in that logistics section. So with that, I will pass it off to David, and he will go into further detail on several other of these data acquisition equipment.
All right, thank you. So now let's get into some of the details here of practically what this actually looks like when we deploy. And I'm going to focus here mostly on the door-to-door assessments, because that still is the core of much of what we do in these deployments. And so it begins with a data collection strategy. How do we decide, particularly with an event like a hurricane that impacts a large area, how do we decide where we are actually going to deploy? And you know, when you think about it, we really only are able to sample a very small part of what is actually impacted. And so it's critical that we collect what we focus on as representative samples. Okay, so we are not here to damage hunt or just simply find the worst damage that we can see. We want to take a scientific approach and take representative samples across both the hazard intensity gradient, but also capture a representative sample of a number of different structure types of, say, new versus old construction, again, to broadly characterize structural performance. Again, emphasizing that this is not a hypothesis-driven approach. We're trying to broadly characterize performance, not just damage, performance. And so we do these by, for example, in this case, this is for Hurricane Florence. And as it was coming ashore, after it was coming ashore, we're identifying these target areas for UAV deployment, as well as door-to-door assessments and other technologies. Okay, so once we selected, if you want to go to the next slide, once we selected a site, we use this, what we typically tend to use what we call this a cluster-based sampling technique, where the cluster may be a neighborhood, it may be a transect through a tornado path, anything like that. And we use a redundant data collection strategy meaning that we typically try to have more than one technology available at a given site. For example, as you see laid out here, this is in Hurricane Michael. And for this neighborhood here, which was a mix of newer and older homes, we were doing door-to-door assessments, as you can see with the individual markers, forensically investigating these individual structures, spending time capturing the details that we'll go over here in just a little bit. But then we were also used the UAV to capture aerial and oblique imagery from all different angles. And we also used the street view camera to go up and down these streets also to capture essentially the complete ground view as much as possible from the road. So the whole idea here is that we want to allow you as the door-to-door teams, those of you that are on the ground with the expertise and structures and hazards, to really do what you do best. Okay, and that is be able to focus on forensic assessments and not have to worry about collecting every little detail of every single building, but instead rely upon the street view camera, the UAV data as well, to capture some of the context to the more detailed assessments that we do. So we'll typically sample every third or so structure within a given cluster. Okay, so that brings us then to how we actually conduct these door-to-door assessments. All right, and so we currently use the FULCRUM app, which is really a platform that consists of both a smartphone app as well as a web-based platform. Within this platform, we are able to develop multiple apps. Okay, so just to be clear in the terminology, there's a FULCRUM app that you would download to your phone, and hopefully you've all got an invite for that and have been able to do it. But within that app, there are also multiple separate apps or assessment forms that we've built out and customized for our application here. And so you'll see on the right just a couple of these. Right now for windstorms, we primarily have our main one is this SIEER building US windstorm. Okay, and this is focused on building performance in the US, including the structural systems and envelopes, impacts of wind, surge, rainwater, etc. We also have a non-building structure assessment form that is more general to capture things like dams and bridges or power infrastructure. And we're still a work in progress of building out some additional apps. Okay, the idea here though is that it's not possible to capture every single combination of every building and every structure. We want to be able to provide some standardized forms though that capture the primary fields, the primary characteristics of common building types, common non-building structure types, to guide you in that assessment process and make sure we're collecting complete and informed data sets. Okay, so along with these apps, you can go back actually one second there. Along with these apps, we also are developing a tsunami app that's under development. We have an earthquake app, but that will be dealt with in a separate webinar. And again, you should have received the email by now inviting you to FULCRUM to be able to set up your account there. All right, so on the left-hand side, in terms of actually using the FULCRUM app, notice there that plus sign, the plus icon down there at the bottom right. That's what you would use to create a record. So once you've selected an app, say the Windstorm app, you would push that button. That would create a new record. All right, and once you create a new record, on the next slide here, let's see, I
just gave you control, so try to click. This might make it easier for you.
Let's see.
Is it working?
It looks like I can.
Oh, you can draw only?
But yes.
All right, then I will continue. I will abort control. Okay.
All right. Okay, so down there where all the red squiggly lines are.
Yes, exactly. All right, let me move us forward.
Okay, thank you.
That's still there. All right. Don't know how to get rid of that.
I'm not seeing it either, so we may just have to continue on for now. All right, or I'll let you work on that in the background. I'll just keep going. Okay, so there you go. So once you create a record, you're going to get a series of fields that look somewhat like this. The very first thing that I want to point out, though, is that one of the most important parts of creating the record is making sure that it's geolocated correctly. This makes the VAST member's job infinitely easier if you can geolocate the record properly. So by default, in FULCRUM, when you create a new record, it's going to assign a location to that record right where you're standing. Okay, but if you're standing in the road, it's somewhat ambiguous then which structure you're actually talking about. So what you need to do is when you create a record, go to that crosshairs icon either at the top in Android or at the bottom in Apple, and that will bring up a map like it's shown there on the right. And you can just scroll that map so where the crosshairs are located directly over the structure that you are investigating. And that will help also in geocoding the address that goes along with it as well. Okay, so that's the first step. Once you've done that, then it brings up a series of fields that you're prompted to fill out. And you'll notice a few things here that I want to point out. So first off, there are some text labels. There's also this little icon that you can click on that will give you a little bit more information about a given field, give you some guidance on what options to select and what they actually mean. You'll also notice some that are starred in red. Those that are starred in red these are required. Okay, anytime you create an assessment, you have to fill out these very basic attributes. Okay, so if you've identified wind as a damage source, you have to give it a wind damage rating. Okay, and then there's other fields within that are designated as field priority. And we're going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. But we recognize that your time out in the field is finite. We want to cover as much ground as possible, but we also want to make sure that we're collecting informative data that we can actually use to advance scientific knowledge. And so we've designated these as field priority because these are the fields that are most difficult for example, the VAST members to fill in from other sources. So while you're there on site, these are the things that you should be looking for. Okay, so these are designated as these field priorities. Go ahead and next. All right, so with that, let me just give you a general overview of, again, the STIEER, the non-building U.S. Windstorm map. It's going to ask for some basic information, the name of the investigator, what day, the assessment type, whether you're on site or just doing a drive-by, et cetera. An overall damage state, the source of the damage, whether it's wind, surge, et cetera. And then also give the opportunity to attach different media to that, so photos or audio or so on. And I'd like to go ahead and point out here as well that while each individual record that you create in FULCRUM is geolocated, every picture that you take is also geolocated individually. Okay, so you maintain all of that within one geolocated record. And then beyond that, you have these conditional sections depending on whether it's a bridge or a dam, power infrastructure, or just a general non-building structure type. This gives some basic fields for you to be able to fill out just some of the main information about it. Again, for non-buildings, the forms are a little bit less, or a little bit more, or they're less detailed because they tend to be more broad and just aren't as well suited for the detail that we're able to get with typical buildings. All right, and then lastly, you'll see a quality control tracking, and that's really just used for the VAST members and to help them track what stage of the quality control process that it's been through. All right, so that brings us to the Windstorm map, which is really the part of these assessments. And there are over, there's almost 100 fields in this app. And as you go through, if you're for example, a metal building expert, or you're a single family home expert or so on, you'll see that even with these 100 fields, it doesn't capture every single possible combination and every option. Okay, and that's intentional. We can't. What we're trying to provide here is, again, the basic details for the most common types of structures and provide a standardized way of assessing and guiding you through that assessment process so that we have informed and standardized data sets coming out of it. Okay, so while there's 100 fields, a lot of these are ones that you're not going to be worrying about while you're in the field. They're things that require supplemental data sources, for example, a property appraiser records to be able to fill out. Okay, so you see the basic information and the same media attachments, the overall damage assessment. Then you get the building attributes, just general characteristics of the building. Then you get to the structural attributes, which really focuses on the structural load path. And again, that's our emphasis here. At the end of the day, most of us are or associated with structural engineering or hazards engineering, and we want to be able to define what that load path is from the roof to the foundation. And then the second aspect of that, which may not be as obvious, is characterizing the fenestration, the openings into the building. For windstorms, openings are critical to determining both the loads that were acting on the structure. and help explaining why the building performed as it did. And so that's a critical aspect of these structural attributes as well. All right, and then we define the wind-induced damage levels. And we do this, you'll notice there's some redundancy here. Okay, so we have an overall damage assessment that has an overall wind damage rating, but we also have individual damage levels, which are, again, these damage ratios from 0 to 100 for 7 of the kind of the standard building components. And this allows us to define more precisely exactly what damage each building experienced. And then we can work and isolate and look more specifically at different components from there. We also have an area for surge-induced damage if it's a coastal structure, and then an area for logging any building retrofits, and then the same quality control tracking. Okay. All right, so very quickly, let me just walk through here the wind damage states. So for wind damage, we use essentially the damage states that are the basis for are used in HAZUS for the hurricane model, and these were developed and put forth in the Vickery et al. In 2006. These are primarily geared towards residential structures, which, as you'll see reflected here, but they are generally applicable to other building types as well. And the key point here, though, is notice that we have these different these gray boxes here, and so you'll essentially go through and you'll see the different components represented here: the roof or wall cover, window or door, roof or wall substrate, roof structure, and wall structure. The idea here is that, for example, if you have roof cover damage between 2 and 15%, you're in minor damage as long as you don't have any other structural damage. The gray indicates that for it to be in that given damage state, from no damage up to destroyed, it has to meet at least the criteria in one of the grayed out, the gray filled cells. Okay. So if all you have is if all you see is roof cover damage, for example, you can't have the last category. You can't have rate the damage as being rated as being destroyed. You have to have at least the majority of the windows or doors blown out, or major roof sheathing damage or structural damage. Okay, so this provides some more quantitative criteria for assigning the wind damage ratings. All right, and then for surge. On the next one, the surge flood damage states. Notice that these are a little bit more descriptive than quantitative. And again, this is just based off of what we have in the literature right now. So this is Friedland and Levitan, 2011, progressive descriptive damage states representing surge and flood damage, everything from no damage or very minor damage all the way up to complete collapse. Okay, with the intermediate, again, more descriptive classifications in between. Okay, and then the last one, the rainwater ingress. So you may look at this and say, well, this isn't really a structural issue, and that's true. But it is important for us, we believe, while we're out in the field, to understand that rainwater ingress does impact the community's ability and that structure's ability to function. And so if we can capture information related to rainwater ingress, then that's helpful as well. And so in a lot of cases, we may not have access to the interior, and we would just be using unknown. But if we do have access, then this gives us a way a standardized way of quantifying rainwater ingress impacts as well. Okay, so again, a key point with all of these damage scales, they're not perfect, especially for representing structural damage. But what's available in the literature right now, and that's actually what we want one of our working groups to start working on, is the more representative overall damage states. All right, so that brings us to these field priorities. And I'm just going to briefly highlight a couple of key areas that when you're in the field, these are some things that we should focus on. And again, the whole idea is that the FULCRUM app and these assessment forms, they're simply a tool to guide the assessment so that we can generate complete and informative data sets. You know, you guys you're the experts, okay? We want you in the field being able to do detailed forensic assessments and really look at the structure and pull out what you think is important for explaining its performance. These forms simply provide a tool for standardizing and guiding you in that assessment. So, yeah, you're not going to define every single field. You know, you're not going to go all 100 fields while you're on site. You know, there's no point in you telling us and spending time saying it's a 2-story building or it's a gable roof or so on. That's something that we can very easily, a vast member could very easily do. And we also want to make sure that when we come out of the field, if all we have about the structure is just 4 pictures, well, anybody could have just taken 4 pictures of the structure. We wanted you to be able to focus on what you know best, really utilize your expertise in assessing the performance of these structures. Okay, so what we've kind of designated as these field priorities are the fields within the app that are most important to understanding the why of the performance, those that are most challenging for our vast members to identify, to build out this complete data set, and then those that are most useful for a preliminary post-deployment analysis. So for the EARR, for example, being able to at least do a basic distribution of single-family homes, here's percentage of minor, moderate, and destroyed homes, just some basic analysis. Okay, so this is typically going to focus on these overall damage ratings, again, the fenestration protection and damage, and then the definition and status of the critical elements of that structural load path. And so we're working on a library of quick reference sheets in addition to some of these that I'll mention today that will again help guide and help you identify and classify some of these key fields. All right, so next. So one of the important ones that I mentioned here before is fenestration. And one of the challenges that's associated with it, if you are familiar with wind engineering, you recognize or understand that when an opening is breached, especially on a windward wall, you can significantly increase the wind loads that are acting on that structure. And many times that leads to the roof thin, the load exceeding the capacity, blowing off, progressive collapse from there. So it's very important for us to understand, is fenestration, has it been damaged? Is it protected? Was it protected before the event or so on? So the challenge here is that if we take photos like this seen here, it's hard to tell. Was this plywood panels that were to protect the fenestration before the storm, or were they installed after the storm to prevent, further damage or looting or so forth? And so you get a case like this where you have about half the windows uncovered and half of them are boarded up. How are we supposed to interpret that? It can mean very different things in terms of the overall assessment. All right, and then on the next slide, I have another example of this with again, here another case where you have about half of the fenestration is boarded up and half is not. And it's very challenging for the VAST members to then look at this and try to assign, say, a damage ratio to fenestration. Is this 50% fenestration is damaged, or were these windows protected beforehand? Maybe all of them were protected beforehand and the homeowner came and took some of them down after the event, or maybe some of them blew off during the event. Okay, so fenestration is critical to being able to focus on while you're in the field. Another example here, the same thing for hurricane shutters. For example, this is in Hurricane Florence. There on the left, you have the hurricane shutters still in place. On the right, you see the frames for the hurricane shutters are in place, but it's unclear just from the picture whether they were installed or not. And so if there's any information you can get while you're on site, either talking with a homeowner or looking, inspecting closer to look at fastener schedules or how it was attached, or, evidence of broken glass, etc., that can help inform whether these were protected fenestration or damaged fenestration. Okay. So again, some tips or general strategies for this. So one, inspect the fastener pattern if they're using plywood or OSB panels. Another is to inspect for evidence of broken glass or a damaged window framing, and then lastly, inspecting for panel markings. Like in this case, if it's numbered 1 and 2, that's generally an indication that these were pre-cut panels and installed before the hurricane. Okay, so next slide. Another critical aspect of the fenestration is identifying impact-resistant openings. And this can be virtually impossible for a VAST member to identify whether it's impact resistant, and yet it can be a critical aspect to determining the resistance of that structure. So we've provided some guidance here as well as in the FAST handbook for certain labels to look for that will help guide that process and identify those. Okay, so related to that, one of the most helpful things that you can do is that if you see really any visible label related to the manufacturer, a wind pressure rating, et cetera, on a garage door or other type of opening, go ahead and just snap a picture of that, or write it down in one of the field notes. Try to capture that information that's critical to helping us determine what the resistance of the structure was. All right, next. Okay, and another one that may not be as intuitive is wall cladding system. There's several cladding systems that look very much alike once they're installed. For example, these two pictures on the right, one is vinyl siding and one is fiber cement board. Okay, these are two different, obviously, manufacturers that deal with these, that make these products, and understandably they're sensitive to their products being misclassified, especially when you start pointing to damage rates and failure rates, et cetera. We can sometimes get this information from public sources such as county records, but many times they don't even include that information, and they're not always very precise. And again, it's difficult many times to identify them from photographs alone. So there's some ways that we've developed to help, but the best case is, again, if you're on site, can go ahead and fill in that field. That's helpful. And also identify things like, is it a wind-rated vinyl siding, or is it a standard siding? Again, capturing a manufacturer's label or something like that on damaged products is very helpful in these cases. All right, and then lastly, but in reality, most importantly, is again this load, going back to this idea of the load path. Okay, so that chain of structural elements that transfer the loads to the foundation. In many cases, again, if the building the structural system is not really damaged, it may be difficult to determine what exactly that structural load path is. In those cases, we simply have to rely upon, okay, when was it built? Was there a building code in force then? And try to pull out what we can from that. But if at all possible, any information that you can provide about the load path is going to help us and help understand what the resistance level of that structure was. So if you can get access to the inside of the home, if the homeowner's there, ask questions, even identifying, is it a wood frame versus a concrete block, or is it a braced frame versus a moment frame, steel building, et cetera. Things like that are critical to helping us understand, again, the resistance and how to classify these different structures. And again, this is, many of you here on this call, this is what you're good at doing, is assessing the structural load path of these buildings, and we want you to be able to focus on that while you're in the field and make that a priority. Okay, so this is just, again, a snapshot of a couple of the things that we found in our deployments so far to be the most helpful. Again, there are many more case studies and different examples like this we're working on and trying to put together. And we certainly welcome any suggestions from you all as well of things to include or ways to better identify different products or systems while we're on site. Okay, so with that, coming up, as we're wrapping up here, just a couple of things to remind you about. One, do stay tuned. There's going to be certainly more training opportunities, webinars, and workshops that we're excited to announce later this fall. Just keep monitoring your email, Slack, and the SIEER website for those. And then please go ahead and review the member guidelines as well as the FAST handbook for two things. One, we are right here in hurricane season. We've got Dorian that we're watching right now, and I'm sure there will be more. Okay, so those that are going to be on these FAST teams, try not to wait till the last minute to start reviewing the handbook. Try to look through it as early as you can, give us feedback on it, ask questions, make sure that we're all on the same page there. Then do verify that your Design Safe Slack account is active. Again, all of our communication related to SIEER outside of some basic announcements is going to be done through Slack. So make sure you have access to that. You can monitor the SIEER channel there. And then go ahead and set up your FULCRUM account. You should have gotten an email from that. If not, let us know. And so download, install the app, configure it according to the guidelines and recommendations we put into the FAST handbook. And then if you'd like, you can also familiarize yourself with the web interface aspect of it as well to see kind of the back end, what the data looks like as it's being collected. All right. And so with that in mind, I will close here with a recommendation or some homework for you. Okay. And so this is a training activity that will help you get prepared. And so we've included two test cases. This test case 1 and test case 2, both of these are from Hurricane Michael. And if you click on these links, it will bring up a slide deck. Within this slide deck will be a series of photos as well as the address. What we'd like you to do is, if you have Fulcrum on your phone, go ahead and just take a picture of the screen, just showing this, that image as if you were on site. And then try to go through the app and fill out and complete the assessment as best you can. Obviously, there's going to be some fields you may not be able to get to, that's fine, but try to just walk through that process and understand the depth and the number of options and so on that are there. Okay, and in particular, I want to point you to that fourth point. For test case 2, there's going to be a layer within Fulcrum, which you can see our handbook, the FAST handbook, to see how to activate a layer. And it gives you a feel for, within Fulcrum, how to activate a layer, in this case, one that shows some high-resolution aerial imagery of one of these buildings. So you can use that to assess, for example, the amount of roof cover that's damaged or the type of roof system it is. Okay, so we're going to be using layers quite a bit in our FAST deployments going forward. And so I want to make sure everybody's on the same page and can access those. Okay, and then when you're complete, go ahead and synchronize it, and we'll be able to review those and provide any feedback from there. All right, so with that, let me turn it back over to Tracy for the remaining minutes.
Yes, thanks, David. Ian, I just want to confirm that you're there on the line and ready to move through the questions that have been queuing up in the chat. Ian, do I have you? Okay, in the event that Ian might be trying to unmute himself or get connected, I'll start with the first question in the queue. It says, surge and wave damage to structures in hurricanes have different signatures. Will the working group be looking at refining the damage states to look at this distinction at all?
All right, sorry, I'm back on.
Ian, you're on. Okay, great.
I muted my phone and the computer had also muted me, so I don't, anyway. Yeah, good question, and maybe I'll tackle answering it because I'm supposed to be the one in charge of surge and tsunami. And then I'll pass over to David R. about whether the app captures those. It is possible to tell the difference in the damage in some cases, but it is also difficult in the field to decide whether it was the surge or wave action above the surge that caused the damage. It's easy when you're looking at damage that is obviously higher than the still water level, the high still water level. But a lot of wave damage happens when the surge is still low, and you cannot tell always whether it's wave damage or surge damage. But let me hand over to David whether the app tries to capture those two as distinct types of damage.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so currently we do have a section in the app for surge damage, but it's based on a coastal damage assessment form that I was sent. It's not really going to be able to capture right now the difference between surge and wave damage. However, you know, I'm flexible. I'm more than happy if someone has some example damage assessment forms that would be able to help guide someone through that process. I'm more than happy to look at it and see if we can incorporate it.
And I believe this question is actually from James. I'm looking at the handle here. The question was, will the working groups be looking at refining the damage states? And the answer is yes. So one of the working groups is going to be focused explicitly on the issue of damage states and bringing in perspectives from multiple hazards to try to refine these and also try to come up with a unified set of SIEER damage states. Right now, we're just working ad hoc from the literature. So we'd love to have your participation on that because that's something we know we need to look at.
Yeah. All right. The second question is from Daniel Smith, and he suggests that water ingress scale could consider the damaged contents, particularly those out in the front yard the day or two after the event, can be a good indicator of the degree of water ingress when access to the inside of the property is not possible. Very good idea, and I'm not sure if that's included already in the app, David, but that's something we could easily add.
Yeah, or that's something for sure that could be added to the FAST handbook and maybe as guidance within the app in terms of determining the rainwater ingress damage state.
Yeah, that's very good. Next question is from Doug Allen. The timing is important to determine fenestration protection. Earlier the better. Absolutely. That's part of the reason that SIEER was formed. I think NSF realized that GEAR, most of you are familiar with the Geotechnical Extreme Event Reconnaissance Group, that they have for a long time been doing this kind of work on geotechnical issues, and NSF has decided that that's a good format, not only for ourselves, SIEER, but also for NEAR, nearshore extreme event reconnaissance, which will also focus on coastal effects, and SIEER, which is the social science, double SEER, and an ISEER, which is interdisciplinary science and technology, ISTEER, sorry, science and technology extreme events. So we are the more than rapid. In fact, that's why your groups are called FAST, F-A-S-T. It's a nice acronym because you're going to be faster than anybody else getting out into the field and trying to get a picture of what things were like during the event as close as you can. The last question is just a logistical thing. Shane Crawford mentioned he hasn't received emails with Google Drive link and the Fulcrum info. So we might do another blast to everybody. So those of you who have received them before, we apologize if you get another blast, but it might be good just to make sure we've covered everybody, Tracy.
Yes, and Shane, I also will follow up just to make sure it's not getting snagged by spam. We do have a STEER.network is a domain that we own that's a third-party domain, and sometimes it gets snagged by spam. So I'll email you directly from my Notre Dame account to make sure that's not happening.
All right. We have another question from Daniel Smith. How does STEER/NSF consider or prioritize events in other countries, e.g. tropical cyclones in Fiji, Australia? You'll actually notice that we have, when you go to the STEER network, I've forgotten the login. But if you go to our STEER webpage, you'll see that we have a map of the world and all of the events we responded to. And yes, the majority are in the U.S., but there are a large number outside of the U.S., and that will continue. It's really up to the leadership of STEER at the moment, and we might form a decision-making group, a leadership group that will make these decisions in the future. But at the moment, it's up to the 5 of us, 4 on this call, and Khalid Masalam, to decide if an event warrants response elsewhere in the world. And so we have had teams go to other places outside of the U.S. Obviously, it's more expensive. NSF focuses typically on the U.S., but if we can learn lessons from tsunamis in other areas or from major cyclones in other regions, then certainly we can go and learn those lessons. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that response.
And all I would say is that one of our goals in building up over the next year or so is to establish regional nodes, both in the U.S. as well as globally, so that we're better positioned to respond swiftly, especially overseas where that's a little more cumbersome. So there's nothing prohibiting that, and we're looking to do that. We just will hopefully build that up over time.
All right, another question. Will you also, this is from A. Mendez. I don't know if it's, I'm sorry, I don't have the membership in front of me, but will you also be estimating the event severity? For example, percentage of structures in none, moderate, complete damage with the hazard intensity zone Y, etc. Yes. Well, I should hand this over to David Roach.
Well, yes. So that is a goal of, again, when I mentioned in the app that one of our priorities is assigning these, these overall damage states and so forth. And that is so that when we come in, just a few days after the event, hopefully we can at least put together a broad, as you mentioned there, percentage of structures in different zones and different hazard regions and the percentages of damage. So taking an overall look at it is certainly possible, and we hope to include in our early access reconnaissance reports.
But also realize that we're only covering, as you saw in the example from Florence, we're only able to cover, our deployments are normally just a couple of days because we want to get the information out rapidly. So we'll cover selected samples of the area. If you have a hypothesis on a type of roof sheathing or lateral framing system for residential houses, then you can use what we've provided to decide, is this an event that I would want a rapid to spend a week or 10 days in the field and do a much more extensive percentage damage type survey. So our intent is not to answer all the questions. Our intent is to raise the questions and leave them for the community to address.
Yes, and that is also the reason that we stress representative samples. If we're going to pull, we want an overall assessment. If we go damage hunting, we don't have a representative assessment. We have a biased perspective on the damage levels. So.
Right. And it looked like it was great timing, right? Because our last question is just related again to access, so I will follow up with Wilfred individually to work that out. Other than that, are there any other questions that anyone wants to pose in the chat before we conclude? We will judge by chat silence that we have satisfied those questions. I will do my homework in re-recording the front end of the webinar to correct for my terrible loss of voice in those first few minutes. Thanks again to Dave Pravat for helping out in that awkward moment for me. So I will re-record that front end, and then this entire recording will be edited together into one clean recording and shared on our website and circulated in the Google Drive along with a copy of the slides for your access. But you can find the slide deck in its entirety in the Google Drive right now. And that will allow you to also take a look at those test cases that David talked about at the end of the webinar to practice. And I will continue to address any issues people are having with Google Drive access. I can see some of those in the chat, and I'll work on that after we conclude.
Okay. Tracy, can I mention one thing real quickly? We still have people online. For these test cases, you'll see when you go into Fulcrum that you have access to both the Windstorm app as well as a training app. Submit the test case to the training app, not our regular app.
Yes. So that's a very good point. Please use the training app for this activity. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We are going to be officially signing off. I'll ask the leadership team to remain on for a few more minutes just to debrief afterward, but the rest of the community, thank you for being with us. We will follow up with the issues noted in the chat for those with access problems, and we look forward to interacting with you possibly as early as this hurricane season in a field deployment.